The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. When the 1920 Florida Historical Society annual meeting was held a century ago in Jacksonville, that city was still feeling the impact of an influenza pandemic that had happened 2 years earlier. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. 100 years later, in 2020, COVID-19 forced the Florida Historical Society to cancel plans for a conference in May and instead present a virtual annual meeting and symposium. The theme of the event was 2020 Hindsight, How Florida's Past Informs the Present and Future. One of the featured panel discussions was called Going Viral: Pandemics in Florida. The panel included well-known Florida historians and authors Gary Mormino from the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and Stephen Knoll from the University of Florida in Gainesville. Valuable insights were also provided by Andrew Kashuni, an honors undergraduate thesis student from the University of Central Florida. The panel was moderated by Connie Lester, editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly.
Many in our audience are already familiar with your work. Please take a moment to give us the elevator speech outlining your work on health, epidemics, and pandemics in Florida. In answering this question, help our audience get a general sense of the health of Floridians in the period 1800 to 1920. And then I may have some follow-up questions. So we'll start with Dr. Mormino.
Certainly. Well, I consider myself a social historian, not really a historian of health. Honestly, I hadn't really given that much thought about the history of health until recently. And what I find fascinating about the flu pandemic is if you went to a history textbook before 1960, I don't believe it's even mentioned. It's one of the great mysteries, kind of the profession, how little had been done about it. One argument about that is that we utterly failed, and as a can-do nation, the embarrassment. The best example here is Alfred Crosby. Has influenced this panel as much as anyone, and when he wrote his book, one of the first books about the flu in 1979, I think it was. He said he was shocked at how little secondary sources had ever been dedicated to that. So as a historian of modern Florida, I'm very interested in World War I. The flu was kind of irresistible to me. And in fact, I should add, I'm finishing a book now on Florida, 1513, 2020, and we're here to finish it on with the great pandemic we're dealing with now. Looking back at it, how paradise and pandemics, what an interesting combination in a state like Florida, where we're seemingly immune from life's afflictions, but not really.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Knoll.
I'm going to come at it from a different angle. A lot of my work has to deal with issues of health regarding mental health and disability, and certainly the fact that the Florida Farm Colony for the Epileptic and Feeble-Minded was established in 1921 right after the pandemic. So looking at whether there's a relationship between that or not, and there goes my phone. Sorry, I have a landline. I am an old man, so but very interesting, this relationship. But I'd also like to look at other pandemics during this time, or epidemics during this time period, and think about that relationship. So in 1887, there was a huge epidemic in Jacksonville. Jacksonville at this point has a population of approximately 10 to 15,000. Almost 5,000 people come down with the flu, with yellow fever at this time. So that's unbelievable. 437 people die. And in response to this, in response to the city's rather amazing lack of ability to deal with this, the governor, Francis Fleming, who's just inaugurated that year, he loses his brother and his law partner to this yellow fever epidemic. The election results have to be held up for 10 days because people can't cross county lines to get through that. And Fleming, the first thing he does is this legislature at this point only goes into session once every 2 years, so they don't do much. But immediately he calls a special session of the legislature to ensure that they will deal with issues of health on a statewide level and develop directly out of the failure of the city of Jacksonville to deal with anything regarding the yellow fever epidemic. And I think that's pretty interesting, as is kind of the story of an earlier yellow fever epidemic in the town of St. Joseph, which today doesn't exist. Okay, Port St. Joe does, and St. Joseph is near that. So in 1838, Florida territorial delegates go to this town, which at this point had a population of about 4,000, which is significantly large in territorial Florida, to develop a constitution for the territory of Florida, assuming Florida will be a state sooner or later. Will be a state in 8 more years, right? So this town has an important place in Florida history. 2 years later, yellow fever epidemic brought by people on ships from the Caribbean destroys the town, and the town doesn't exist after 1840. So if you look on the map today for the town where the Florida Constitution, first Florida Constitution was developed, it's not there. So certainly these ideas about health and pandemics and epidemics are rife throughout Florida history, not just the great pandemic of 1918, which is really amazing, but other ones as well. And certainly I think the one, and Gary mentioned this, the one that we really at some point need to talk about in Florida is the great long-lasting Columbian Exchange pandemic. Alfred Crosby writes a book called The Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange pandemic is basically the destruction of indigenous people in Florida because of diseases of which they have no immunity. And so, that at some level is not seen in terms of health or pandemic. Just see, well, Europeans came and they brought this disease, they didn't know. Well, at some level, it's as draconian a pandemic, certainly, as this, and probably much more so, and needs to be looked at in those terms. So when we see, oh my gosh, this is horrible, this pandemic, yes, it is. The fact that all these people have died, the fact that all these people die in 1918, yes, terrible. But certainly, if we look at the pandemic brought about by European contact, by European encounter, that is, to me, the ultimate pandemic in American history in general, and in Florida history in particular.
Thank you. Mr. Kashuni?
Hello. Most of my work revolves around the history of infectious disease in 20th century US. And my thesis focused on the Spanish flu, the so-called Spanish flu, the flu pandemic in 1918 in the South. I study the historical epidemiology of the flu, so its morbidity and mortality distribution in different communities throughout the South, throughout Florida. And recently I've been interested in the American Empire and the flu pandemic in American colonies abroad, and of course shaping post-World War I international relations, US foreign policy, with how the US conducted global health policy in the years to come. I've recently become interested in spatial and geographic history of the flu. with the maps that I've been putting together with a friend of mine from Tennessee Technological University, where we map flu mortality in 1918 in Florida to understand the different mortality load between races, African American and white, in different counties throughout Florida in 1918. So that's where my work is currently at, and I'm hoping to put together a larger project on not just quantitatively addressing the historical epidemiology of the pandemic in Florida, but also having context and qualitative sources to understand the experience of suffering and responses to the pandemic.
So both Professor Knoll and Mr. Kashini brought up the issue of race. And so I would like for you to comment a little bit about the kinds of issues that came up in the pandemic that dealt with or affected, had different effects racially and different effects perhaps by class. So Professor Momino?
Certainly. That's one of the great parallels, but that's true of all plagues, I believe. The poor, immigrants, laborers are almost always affected. During World War I, now we have to remember, by the way, that the Spanish flu occurs during World War I. Now, let's take a broader lens here. If you look at the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and 1915, there really had not been a major world war. And there was a word to describe Western Europe, America, it was progress. Many of the great epidemics of the past had been wiped out. Streetcars, department stores, the quality of life was improving. And then you have this disaster of World War I on a colossal level. I think fought over five continents. And the suffering is just tremendous, on the battlefield. But in America, the number of lives lost, I believe it's around 400,000 more than died in World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam is one way of looking at it in perspective. During the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, for instance, in Ybor City, almost all the group most hardly hit was Cubans and Italians in West Tampa and Ybor City. Something three of every four Latins in Ybor City suffered. African Americans suffered. One of the problems was we really didn't have a modern health system up at the time. Moreover, during pandemics, the natural tendency is to flee. So many doctors simply left, saving their lives. For instance, Steve mentioned the yellow fever epidemic, 1870s and 1880s. One of the great heroes there is this black doctor in Jacksonville, the first black physician, Alexander Darnes, heroically was treating yellow fever patients at this time. In Tampa, there was no hospital for African Americans in 1918. So that's one huge parallel between wars. I'm sure I'll think of other things later, but Steve, take it away.
Certainly, again, I'm going to focus on the yellow fever epidemic. And Gary is right. Most of those people who had the means and the financial resources to leave the city do. Of course, the problem is many places won't take them. So there's a great picture in Harper's Weekly of a train heading to Waycross, Georgia, and militiamen are standing there with weapons, and the voice bubble says, and the assumption is if you are from Jacksonville, you can't get off here. But wealthy people do flee the city, leaving the toll to be taken by the poor people, poor whites and African Americans. And unbelievably true in this case. And particularly hard hit is the Black neighborhood of La Villa, which just had been the year before annexed into the city of Jacksonville. It had been its own city, but it's annexed into Jacksonville to kind of to negate the political power of African Americans within that community. So if it's in the city of Jacksonville, they will not be able to elect Black councilmen or elect a Black mayor. So this combination of political instability tied in with the fact that poor and African American communities are bearing the brunt of this lead to, I'm sure, as Andrew has found, showing us statistically that the numbers within those communities are significantly higher percentage-wise than for white and particularly for wealthier individuals. And so it's basically the same story back then as today.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. The connection between the experience of disease, morbidity, the actual infection, and the death of it from it, mortality, is in the history of Florida always disproportionately put on the marginalized and oppressed, and usually those without access to the written word. So their stories are kind of lost in the historiography. And that's why we haven't covered it extensively, because according to most historians that come out of the turn towards the history of medicine in the second half of the 20th century, those stories don't exist. The yellow fever epidemics in Tampa and Jacksonville in 1887 and 1888, and on to the 1918 pandemic, and then forward. The four big diseases of poverty of the South are yellow fever, malaria, hookworm, and pellagra. And in most of those diseases, one would find heightened morbidity and mortality among African Americans and poor whites. Unique about malaria and yellow fever is that, unlike influenza, which has environmental components in the sense that deforestation will move bird populations and they will mix with local domesticated bird populations, thus spawning a pandemic if it's a novel type of virus. Yellow fever and malaria are vector-borne diseases. And because they're connected to mosquitoes, they have unique ecological tethers. So influenza can reach wherever people go. The higher the density of an environment, the better it is for the flu virus. Better is for any kind of virus. But yellow fever and malaria are unique in that, like dengue and other Zika, other mosquito-borne diseases, it depends on where you live that will dictate who first suffers from the illness. And so African Americans and poor whites live in swampy areas, rural areas, areas outside of the zones where the Department of Health has some control, where hospitals are accessible. And so they are left to fight disease alone. The historian Margaret Humphreys has written extensively on malaria and yellow fever and talks about how at one point in American history, it extended all the way to the tip of Canada. But with industrialization and with public health initiatives in the north, it pushes malaria and yellow fever down towards the south, where they don't see those kinds of initiatives for a wide range of reasons: corruption, poverty, and of course the Civil War. And so those that are left in that death grip of yellow fever and malaria are those who don't have access or denied access because of their skin color. And it's the same thing with 1918. The difference is that it's now no longer tethered to a swampy region outside of a big city, but now it's widespread across the state. Military mobilization is occurring, which is facilitating the spread into big cities with large bases. So Jacksonville has Camp Johnston. Pensacola is obviously a big military city. And so those cities will be struck first because of mobilization. My work seeks to understand not the first initial deaths of the virus, in the 1918 flu, but where mortality was most intense, which appears to be for Black people in those rural areas where they would not have access to social services, to hospitals, just geographically. Even if they did live in cities, those basic services would be denied to them because of legalized segregation. So the history of disease is the history of race to some extent.
We've talked about various ways and various lenses for historians to look at the 1918 pandemic, but let's think about then how we're going to look at the current pandemic. What lens will be most useful for understanding the pandemic, recognizing that our vision is somewhat limited at this point. But what do you see as the most important lens for looking at the pandemic now and maybe comparing it to the 1918?
Let me look at it in two ways. I think looking at a macro level, kind of the worldwide international implications of what globalism means. That, that the China virus, that the international implications of a global world, a global economy, and how that affects everything. So I think that's an important way to look at how this thing spread, how it can be stopped, the relationship of different countries, that borders and walls don't stop viruses, don't stop microbes, as Andrew said, and that how can we stop this? How can we deal with it? So this international stuff, and also on a very micro level, getting the stories of individuals who have been affected, because I think at some level those stories are being lost as people are dying, and I think it's really important for us to get their stories and understand the human toll that this has taken on Florida as a state, on the United States as a nation, and on the world as a whole, that this is something that is about people, and people who have lost loved ones, people who have lost livelihoods, people who have lost everything. And if we don't tell their story, it will just be, oh, a pandemic took place in the second decade of the 21st century and people died, here's the number. And if we want to be historians that look at stories, which is what history is, we need to get the stories of those people.
To compare and look at future ways of addressing the history, I think a good comparison would be the distribution of mortality race-wise, which is most of my work. In 1918 in Florida, Black people in 76% of Florida counties had higher mortality rates than white people. It was that the historians who had addressed Floridian mortality did not address the proportion to race. They addressed raw mortality numbers in which white people died more because there was more of them to die. But when those death numbers are put over the population size corresponding to race, one would see that in most Florida counties in 1918, Black people fared worse. The CDC just put out a study, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, that analyzed mortality data in America for children, in which the children make up a very small majority of deaths, or I'm sorry, a very small minority of deaths. There's not, I think it's like 0.03% or something like that of COVID deaths in America are children, but almost all of them are Hispanic or Black. And so that is the consistency between epidemics and pandemics in America, and Florida is a part of that. We will have to address inequality and inequity more, not just as historians, but as voters, as scientists, as active agents in the democratic process.
Anyone want to make further?
Oh, sure. Well, the fact that we're waiting in Zoom probably tells you a great deal of the consequences. One of the problems, and I'm really worried in that I'd like to complete this book with the last chapter on the topic of today, the pandemic, but we don't know how it's going to end. That's the problem. Are we going to have a third wave, a fourth wave? Who has any idea. You just think about our profession that conferences may be dinosaurs now in the future. We're teaching online, probably not very well. I teach a class on food and history. I taught summer, and I mean, I think, will we ever see a buffet line again? That's hardly significant, but almost every aspect of American society is being touched by this.
But Gary, that may be one good result, not having a buffet line.
The panel discussion Going Viral, Pandemics in Florida was presented as part of the Florida Historical Society virtual annual meeting and symposium in October 2020. To see the entire conversation, go to myfloridahistory.org. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.